Hey guys, it's Justin back with an engineer's perspective, and I'm making a video that's going to be discussing the major hurdles I've overcome so far to increase my sharpening ability. So I've made a little list over here of notes, but I think there's four major things that I really want to touch on in order of importance, I guess. And I'm just going to get right into it. The first major thing that I had to get over, well, actually, you know what? Let's back up. Is almost all of these have to deal with the burr. Okay? So if you are struggling to get the edge that you want, I can only speak from my own experience and then, like YouTube videos I've seen, but I'm just guessing it's probably has to do with burr management in some shape or form. And for me, what it would manifest into is I wouldn't manage the burr properly for some reason, and then I would go through everything and I'd be on my last stone and I just could not reduce the size of the burr. Couldn't do it, and I'd spend forever trying to do it, and then I'd go to strops, and then I'd spend so long trying to strop the burr away that I'd end up rounding over my apex or just over polishing it or something, and it would just ruin the aggression. So the result was I'd either have an edge that was aggressive with a burr or an edge that was not aggressive with no burr, and those aren't ideal. So let's kind of dig into that. So the first and the biggest one, and this took me like 6 months to realize, is an inconsistent angle was the problem. So that's kind of like, well, no duh, you have to have a consistent angle to get a sharp edge. But what would happen specifically, I don't know if I really need a stone to demonstrate, but what would specifically happen is I'm right-handed. So I'd sharpen right-handed. Everything would be, let's say, exactly 17 degrees per side. Switch to my left hand because I sharpen ambidextrous. So I'd sharpen 17 degrees per side, tip 17 degrees per side. And this is what would happen is right here, I would dip. I would go like that on accident. I don't realize it. And instead of hitting 17, now this one is 18 degrees per side. It's a little bit steeper. So I'd do that, do that. So now I've got 17 degrees on the right side, 17 degrees maybe on the left side from tip to the belly, and then it'd be like 18 degrees back here. So I do that on the coarse grit, go up to the fine grit, 17, and then maybe on this side I'm doing 17, and then for a little bit maybe I'll do 18 over here a little bit. So it's on the finer grit, so it's not as bad as on the coarse. But then I go to this side, I do my thing, and then now that I've sharpened both sides on the fine grit, now I'm trying to do those burr reducing strokes. So I'm doing this, trying to flip the burr completely over to this side, and I'd feel the burr here, but I wouldn't feel it here, because when you're stropping at 17 degrees per side, the part of this edge that's at 18 degrees is like protected up away from the stone. And so you can't flip that burr to this side. So basically you'll deburr everything that's at 17 degrees, but at 18 degrees, that one spot, that's gonna still have a burr. So I'd go to the other side and it'd be the same thing. So I'd flip the burr from here to here, but then the 18 degree spot, the burr would still be sticking out that way because it won't flip because it's not contacting the stone. So once I figured that out, then basically two remedies. Number one is you just got to get better at your angle control. So if you got to go slower to do that, do so. Is better angle control. And the other one is just taking more time. That lowest grit stone, cannot stress this enough, is the most important grit. If you don't form that apex on the lowest grit stone completely, then everything that happens after that doesn't really matter that much. So whatever your first grit stone is, that's where you got to make it happen. If you're detecting that you might have some angle inconsistencies, then you got to keep going on that section or the whole thing, however you want to do it. But you got to keep going. So that's number one, is that inconsistency in my angle makes it so it's impossible to deburr, because when you're deburring it, you're just not hitting that part of the edge. So that's number one. And if you're finding you're getting great results on, this is basic of basic, this is white number one, just iron and carbon. If you're doing great on steels like this, and then struggling on steels like S30V, or a good example is K390, then that's a good indicator you're just not spending long enough on that coarsest grit stone and fully forming that apex. So that's number one. And yeah, I mean, that goes into, I guess, what for number two, I wrote fully forming the apex. And that's kind of the same. I mean, technically, you can fully form the apex if your angle's inconsistent, but you have to make sure that you're fully forming it. So yeah, I mean, that pretty much spoke to that. So number two is just making sure you fully form it. Spend longer on your coarsest grit. That's the number one thing. Make sure you fully develop a burr on that side. Make sure you fully flip the burr to the other side. So those are the first two. Burr size management, that's another really major one. And this is tough. This is where skill really helps a lot, because if you're spending longer to fully form that apex, then you tend to form a bigger burr on the parts of the knife that are properly apexed. And this is something that's just going to come with skill. But the biggest point of advice, like if you do these big strokes and that's how you sharpen, that's one of the advantages of working, you know, I just work this back section here, then I work the belly, then work the tip. That's an advantage of that, is if this is the only area that needs work, then you can just work that spot instead of developing a bigger burr out front. But if you're doing a 2-stone progression, depending on the stones that you've got, that can help make up for you having made a very large burr. So if you make a really large burr on that low grit stone, you really got to spend some attention and some time making sure that on your fine grit stone that you are knocking that burr down and really reducing it as you go. And then the longer you have to do that, the more inconsistencies you build in. But that's what you're going to end up having to do. And I personally think developing a big burr on the coarse stone and then removing it on the fine stone is a better plan than not fully apexing the edge. So that's why I kind of did the order of my major hurdles here, is it's worth having a big burr to fully form the apex than it is to have that be really small from the get-go. But once your skill increases enough and you kind of focus on the sections that need help, is keeping a small burr throughout the whole process makes it a heck of a lot easier to remove later. And then number 4, the last one I'm going to mention is just proper deburring strokes. And this is where I'm still at a little bit, still fully discerning. But basically is if you sit and strop and strop and strop motions all day long, and especially if you do it heavy-handed, you are going to be there all day. On steels, this particular S30V isn't too bad, but I've sharpened S30V, and I've sharpened a lot of the German knives. German kitchen knives can struggle with this. Is if you've got a temperamental burr that just doesn't want to break off, you can strop all freaking day. It'll just go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and it'll just never break the stupid thing off. So you got to accelerate that process with an edge leading stroke, because in my experience, the stropping strokes are good at reducing that burr down, but they will not get rid of it. So that's why when you see me sharpen, I will, after I form the burr and then refine the burr, when I start reducing it, the first thing I'm going to do are these trailing, edge leading, edge trailing, edge leading, edge trailing, edge leading, because it seems to have the best combination of burr reduction and burr removal, because you're kind of reducing and drawing that burr out and then cutting it off. And you got to do a very light pressure because you don't want to smush your apex when you're doing this. But combining edge trailing and edge leading strokes really helps actually like reduce and remove that burr. So don't just sit and strop. And you know, on some steels that are very forgiving, like this white number 1 that's like 64 Rockwell, this stuff is way more forgiving of stropping motions because it doesn't want to hold on to a burr nearly like softer, you know, S30V or X50 CRMOV 15 steel is going to want to do. So you got to play it per the steel. You know, some steels, like here's a good example of like AEBL. You can be so lazy with this steel because it's so easy to deburr on. So sometimes I just rip it, don't even pay attention to the burr that much. And then on the fine stone, it's just so easy to remove that burr down the road that I'm just like, whatever. Crew air is similar in that way. It's just so easy to deburr that, you know, it's very forgiving of making mistakes, and you can be a little bit lazier with it. So I guess that's all I've got. So in terms of the major hurdles I've overcome and the ones that I'd recommend you look at yourself if it's something that you're struggling with. So yeah, just to review, number 1 is inconsistency in your angle, which makes deburring difficult. Number 2 is fully forming that apex on the very first stone. Number 3 is burr size management. And then number 4 is proper deburring or reducing burr strokes. So those are the 4 major jumps I've seen in my sharpening. And those are something I recommend you should check out if you're struggling to get an edge that's both refined and aggressive. So that's all I've got for today. Thanks for watching. Have a good one. Bye.